Okay, folks, welcome back here to the Real Men of Real Estate radio show on KCAA Radio. This is Patrick Franz, the Note Mentor. I'm your host, of course, and I am back with Mary Hart. And I know those folks that had listened to the segment prior to that commercial break had to have stayed because they're enthralled with everything you're saying, Mary. So let's get right back to it. And, we were leaving off about the 4 pillars and breaking down the importance of each. And we went from mindset to knowledge. Got to change your mindset to think bigger, to achieve bigger. You got to get the knowledge to be able to do the things you need to do. You have to have a network of people, because success is not a one-person job. And then you also have to take action. You can't just sit around and think it'll happen. You have to go and do it. Right.
Yeah.
And when somebody has the right mindset, they've changed their mindset, they've listened and read the books, they're developed, they're ready to rock, they've gained the knowledge. Maybe they've paid for training. Maybe they've just got it out there on YouTube and books and done it the Hard 8 style. Who knows? But they've got more knowledge than they had before, which will allow them to do other things in life than they have before. And now they build their network. They get people like Mary Hart that can help them with entities and protection. They get people like Patrick Franz who can teach them how to do the notes and so on. And they have this network of people and start to build the relationships. Now, this is a heavy feat. And then now after that, they have to have the bravery to take the action. So I love those 4 pillars. Let's say somebody got there. Somebody got there, Mary. They changed their mindset. They got that knowledge. They've got their network in place and they're ready to rock and roll and take this action. Well, somebody goes and takes action. They may even take action the wrong way. This is a part of the knowledge you need to have, and where Mary comes into play like hotcakes. So would you invest into a mortgage note with your personal name? Mary Hart is buying the mortgage note, or would you use some sort of an entity like an LLC or something like that?
So in general, I don't believe in investing in your personal name, because then you're just wide open to potential claims of creditors. With a note, it's not as risky as owning an actual house, unless you have to take the house back, because nobody sues the bank when you slip and fall. But even then, I would rather hold it in either a trust or an LLC. And that is because of several reasons. But let's say an LLC, that way, if I do have to take the house back, now it's owned in my limited liability company, and there is a creditor protected wall between that LLC and my personal assets. So if somebody slips and falls in that house, they can't go get my stock account or my other properties or anything like that, if everything is set up and managed correctly. So I like an entity, and either a trust or an LLC, or a trust with an LLC as its beneficiary, and you owning the LLC. So yeah, I like some form of entity.
Yeah. And, it helps in so many different ways. I mean, you just hit on, I think, a 1 or 2 minorly, but I mean, there's a big deal here, guys. There's a big deal. There's a big deal on protection. There's a big deal on taxes, isn't there? There's a difference in taxes, isn't there? If you own something in your personal name versus owning it in an LLC, the profits made on that investment are actually taxed differently. Isn't that right?
Well, that depends, not necessarily, because the LLC is usually an entity that passes through the income and deductions to the members. So it kind of depends on how the asset is structured. But I think all these things, you're spending all this time learning and growing and making these deals, but we want to bubble wrap them, right? What is the bubble wrap that protects all these investments that you've spent so much time learning about and investing in? And I think due diligence, we've talked about that, is huge. Setting up your proper entity structure to own your investments, whether it's notes or other investments, in a way that is the most protected. Taxes can be part of it, depending on the type of asset. Certainly creditor protection, ease of management, ease of passing it down to the next generation. So that's the estate planning. That's part of your bubble wrap as well, right? You're going to work so hard, and then at your death or disability, do you want your investments eviscerated by estate taxes, gift taxes, creditors, medical bills, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. So there are many, many things we need to look at in the bubble wrap. We make all this money. How do we protect it? And how do we pass it on when we're gone? So those are all very important topics.
Let's talk about it. Let's expound upon that a bit. Okay. Because I know that you also use statements and I love them, but you also were talking about the layers of the onion.
Yes.
And people understand that statement, but maybe not how you're going to relate it to this. Okay. Right. So what's the layers of the onion? And then after that, let's get right into really protecting, if you do have success, you do have assets, you are getting some cash flow, you got where you wanted to get financially, and then you want to leave that as a legacy to people, right? And how we would protect that, and how would people make sure that they're not getting themselves in trouble upon their passing, right? But what about what are these layers of the onion you speak of?
So I've been using that metaphor, layers of the onion, for probably 20 years, as I've been teaching for 30 years. But for the last 20, I've used this metaphor because I heard somebody else say it. I didn't make it up, but I use it in the context of asset protection planning because I think of that as layers of the onion. So what's the outer layer? The outer layer is be a good steward of your asset, of your property. So if you own a rental home, keep the snow melt on the sidewalk, make sure the lighting is safe and common areas are well lit, things like that. So be a good steward of the property. That's the first layer of the onion. Second layer of the onion is have the best insurance that you can afford and make sure it is the right type of policy. If you own a vacation rental house, make sure you have the right type of policy that will cover a vacation rental. If you have a note, make sure you have what we call forced place insurance. So if the homeowner stops paying their insurance, there's an insurance policy that goes into place at that point. So that's the second layer, is have the right insurance and have the best insurance that you can afford. The third layer is look at owning things and entities that protect you from creditors, the LLCs. Trusts in and of themselves are not creditor protected vehicles unless they're an irrevocable trust. But when we use a revocable trust, like a paper trust or a land trust or a living trust for estate planning, we can hold assets in those trusts. We just need to do extra things to protect them. So that's the next layer. The fourth layer is, how do we layer entities? Do we have like a note owned in a paper trust, which is just a revocable trust where you're the person who sets it up and you or your LLC is the beneficiary? You know, who's the beneficiary of that paper trust? Who's the, so on and so on. How many layers do you use? How far up you go is depending on your situation. But those are the layers of the onion, is just how deep you need to go within that onion depends on your personal situation and, how paranoid you are or how protected you want to be, how much you're willing to pay and how much tediousness you're willing to undergo to be as most protected as you can. Does that make sense?
100%. And I think, a question just maybe, because I know that I had this question in the past. I may know more about it nowadays, but, there might be some new investors on here, and, let's say they do get intrigued with mortgage notes. Maybe they've never heard about them. They find out about them. Oh, goody, I want to go do that now. But maybe they've already previously been investors. Maybe they have stocks in the stock market. Maybe they have 2 rental houses and they're landlords. And then they want to add notes to this. Do you suggest that somebody put their mortgage note investments into the same LLC or the same pool as their rental properties and other investments all in one pool? Or do you say somebody should have separate entities for each? What's your take on that?
Well, my take is definitely in your scenario to have separate entities. And here's why. Anything you commingle within one entity is going to share potential liability. So if you have your notes in the same LLC as rental properties and somebody slips and falls in your rental property and sues your LLC, if they get a judgment, they may or may not be able to have access to all of the assets in that LLC, including the notes. And in that particular situation, notes have very little liability compared to actually owning the property. That's one of the benefits of notes, is nobody sues the bank when somebody slips and falls. They don't. You're not responsible for the actual property unless you have to take it back. So I certainly would segregate my notes out into a separate LLC so they're not tainted by any potential liability of my single family homes or my multifamily homes or whatever it is that you have. So absolutely separate entities for me in those two examples.
And we talked about, we talked about a blanketing something with a trust, if that's probably not the right terminology, but you have a trust own the asset. So a trust owns the note, and then the LLC becomes the main beneficiary of that trust. Explain that a little bit. And also, secondary question to add on to that is, then would you have one trust that would own rental properties and notes and have 2 separate LLCs as beneficiaries? How does that work?
So these types of trusts you're referring to are revocable trusts. So let's say I set up a trust, and I'll call it the 123 trust. It doesn't matter what the name is. I set up this revocable trust and I have the trust by my note, for instance. And Patrick, let's say I made you my trustee I trust you. You're my trustee. You're going to sign on the dotted line for me. Okay. And I'm the beneficiary. I mean, I don't want to be the beneficiary as an individual, by the way. We'll get to that in a minute. But whoever the beneficiary is has the right to direct the trustee as to what actions to take. So I direct you to buy note 1. So that trust, we'll call it a paper trust because it's going to own the paper, the promissory note. It buys that promissory note. You're the trustee, so you sign on the dotted line. And then somebody is the beneficiary of that trust. I would name my LLC that I own personally as the beneficiary of that. Why? Because if something happens and somebody sues that paper trust and they get a judgment, that LLC is the beneficiary, puts an absolute creditor protected wall between the judgment against the trust and me personally. If it is set up and managed correctly and a creditor can have access to the trust, because it itself is not a creditor protected entity, by the way, it provides some anonymity and smoke screens. But if somebody sues that trust and wins and they try to come after my personal assets, they're not going to get it, or any other of my LLCs or other trusts. So that's how it works. And you can stack up those layers. You can say the paper trust owns the note. That trust has an LLC as the beneficiary, or maybe another trust as the beneficiary, which then has the LLC as the beneficiary of it. So you can stack up layers. Yeah. So that's what I do. I like trust or LLCs if there are other people involved, particularly LLCs. Like my note business now, I have 2 of my adult sons in it, and I'm managing it for the most part, but I want to be able to centralize the management when 3 of us are owners and 1 check comes in made out to the LLC, not a third to the 3 owners. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And, very beneficial too, like you said, when somebody passes away. I mean, we're all going to pass away at some point, right? And some people take long to try to get things set up properly. They don't think preemptively. And all of a sudden, then they get into bad health, or maybe they even pass suddenly. And all of a sudden the family's left either arguing or figuring out who gets what or how to cash it out. And then it goes to probate and all this stuff. And so I know you're also an expert on saying, hey, once you have assets and you've achieved wealth, also there's a way to stack that to where if you pass, it's not a mess.
Yes, that's correct. And I practiced estate planning for over 30 years as an attorney. So I know a lot about this subject, and a lot of people ignore it. And what they're doing is when something happens and they die or become disabled, now their family has to pull out a sword and fight the battles, which would have been much easier if you just would have given them the shield to protect everything from the get-go and be proactive and not reactive. And I think people need to learn how assets are titled, which dictates how they pass at death. And then make sure you have the right document to pass the asset the way you want it to pass. So for instance, if Patrick and I owned a note as joint tenants with rights of survivorship, if I died, Patrick would own it automatically. If we owned it in an LLC and he owned half and I owned half, when I die, my LLC would go through my estate. Do I have a will? Is it in a trust? How does that pass? Patrick's half would pass through his estate plan. So it's something that everybody needs to think about as you structure your entities, your investing life, your personal life, is how are these things going to be managed and passed on if you become disabled or die? You can save your family and your loved ones a lot of grief and time and expense. And I call that estate plan your ultimate love letter, because I think it's your ultimate love letter.
Oh my goodness. So we need hours and hours of you. I'll tell you that. But folks, we're going to take another commercial break here, and we're going to be right back with more of Mary Hart. I know you're going to want some more of Mary Hart. I know I do. Don't go anywhere, because when we come back, we're going to give some more insight on how you can get a hold of her and maybe visit her website and reach out to her if you want her to help you set up your investment game proper from the beginning, or maybe even take you backwards and reset it up because now you're learning, oop, maybe I didn't do this right. But folks, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back here on KCAA Radio in just a minute.